denkst du vielleicht grad an mich und singe ich ein Lied für dich von 99 Luftballons und dass sowas von sowas kommt.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today's guest is James Stejskal. Thank you very much for taking your time out of your day to join us for a little chat about your books, and also your service. 35 years to your country. You served in the Special Forces and the CIA as well, and that enabled you to travel the world.
It did. Great to be here, Jason. Nice to be talking to somebody from way up there in the Northwest. That's where part of my family's from, actually. But yeah, it's. I was lucky enough to serve that long and come back in one piece, more or less. So I'm just happy to be here.
Well, that's good. So, a question for you: that you, when did you join the Army?
I joined right after I figured out that college was not for me. It was in the first year of the university, and that was 1973.
So the Vietnam War, I mean, on paper, it was still on, but all the Americans had left, or I'm sure there were a few agency guys who were there and a handful of Marines, perhaps, but the war, for all intents and purposes, was over, right?
For the most part, there were still some Special Forces people up into just before everything fell apart. Some of the Joint Casualty Resolution Center people were in Thailand and such, but yeah, we were pretty much laid out of there. In fact, my birth year, 1954, was the last draft year. And they actually canceled the draft just before I joined the Army. So I pulled them in. I enlisted anyway.
And so a lot of, with that in mind, where I'm going with this, a lot of your instructors would have been, had served during the Vietnam War. And I'm sure were any of them SOG guys from MACV SOG?
Not when I went through basic training or infantry training. They were all Vietnam veterans. I think probably 98% of them were Vietnam veterans. A lot of the officers were former helicopter pilots. They were about to start the reduction in force, and a lot of officers were going into the training field, and then they would be shoved out soon. But all of my instructors, all the drill sergeants were Vietnam veterans.
So during this slowdown, and for people that are listening to this, I mean, Special Forces guys, and correct me if I'm wrong here, any special operations are the first to be cut back after a war, right? So I mean, and with the officers, I know that they were trained. They didn't need that many men anymore, right?
Yeah, Special Forces got hit especially hard in the mid-70s. They got cut back from about 12,000. I think the height was 12,000 during the Vietnam War, and it went back to probably 3,500 total.
Wow.
So, yeah, a lot of people were forced out, either out of Special Forces to serve elsewhere in the Army, or they were sent out of the Army altogether. The officers were basically given the option, some officers were given the option to come back as an enlisted person, and I'd say 95% of them did not want to do that.
So where did your life with, or your service with the Special Forces, where did that take you?
Well, I did not start out in Special Forces. I started out as an airborne infantryman, and the only place to do that was to go into the 82nd Airborne or the 101st Airborne Divisions. And soon the 101st would be made an air mobile division. So I ended up as an infantryman in a line infantry company in the 82nd Airborne. And it was from there that I volunteered for Special Forces and went through the qualification course, selection and qualification, and completed that luckily, and was sent to 10th Special Forces Group, which was one of 3 active groups at the time. And we were oriented, our operations or mission were oriented on Eastern Europe because of the Cold War against the Warsaw Pact. So I was in 10th Group initially.
And so this is kind of the segue. So you were in Det A, right? And so you went into Germany with that?
Not, I was 10th Group. Det A was not part of 10th Group. Okay. It was associated with 10th Group, but it was a separate individual unit. 10th Group I was with was in the United States. There were 2 battalions in New England, and there was 1 battalion forward in southern Germany. So I served with the 2nd Battalion, which was in the United States, and we were doing exercises and training in Europe, the Mediterranean. And I found out about Detachment A. It was classified at the time, and nobody knew about it, not very much. And I happened to run into one of the Detachment A soldiers on an exercise in Germany. And he was in civilian clothes, long hair. And I was about 2 years into my time with 10th Group, and I realized that I wanted to be what he was. So that I spent about another year with 10th Group before I was permitted to be reassigned forward to Berlin to Detachment A, which had the classified title 39th Special Forces Detachment. So it was a small unit of about 90 people.
Now, when you were with that, in Det A, did that take you into, communist-held, territory?
Well, Detachment A was stationed in West Berlin, which was occupied territory, occupied by the British, French, and the Americans, and also the Russians, but we were inside East Germany. We were 110 miles behind the front line, essentially. Just waiting for World War III to happen. And that was our whole purpose in life, was if the Russians moved against NATO, against Western Europe, our mission was to try to help to slow them down. As one would expect, the Russian forces would hit the lines in West Germany, but they'd have to bring up more and more forces from the Soviet Union, from the Czech Republic, from Poland. And our mission was to hit the rail lines around Berlin, which was the focal point of the entire Russian transport system moving troops forward. So if we could interdict that, we could slow down the troops, slow down the movement. So our mission was to try to slow the Russians down for 48 to 72 hours. So basically 90 guys out in the countryside trying to cause trouble.
Now, with that in mind, my last interview was with the author and veteran Jack Murphy, and in his new book that's not out yet, we Defy, he does a chapter about Det A, and I asked him about, because you guys are Army, but yet you're going behind enemy lines, as it were. If you were to be captured, he was saying that a lot of the Det A guys had like a complete cover story, and that was quite interesting to hear about the very interesting cover stories. That one guy was like a basketball coach or something. That was his, job. Or, but I know the question that I had asked you off air was about your accent. If someone is behind, if you're in East Berlin, and it must be, what I'm trying to get out is, it must be very difficult to be undercover and always be that other person.
Yeah, you brought up a lot of things I could touch on, but basically Detachment A was the only American military unit that was trained and equipped to go undercover as members of another country. Some of our guys could pull off a German identity, and so they were issued counterfeit identification that would identify them as a German. They could speak German fluently. They might have an accent that placed them somewhere, but for the most part, they could handle it. The rest of us, I mean, we had some guys that from Poland, from Yugoslavia. There were those of us who were born in the United States. We had to adopt a country that we could fit a cover into, and we were given identification that would make sense. We had some guys that were students that were in Germany from South Africa or Rhodesia or Ireland even. We had a couple of Spanish guys who had would be given Spanish passports. Myself, because of my Greek background, I had Greek identification. And so these documents were made in the United States and given to us, not for day-to-day operations, but in case of war. So that, I mean, just like the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, you would go in with an identification, and it may or may not get you through a checkpoint. It depends on who you were at. You know, if I tried to bluff my way through an East German security service checkpoint, I could never have done it if I tried to pretend I was a German. But as a different nationality, you're talking about a different story. Hopefully, we would never find ourselves in that position to get checked.
Now, you know, the Stasi, I mean, they were completely evil. And again, for the listeners, if you don't know who the Stasi were, you know, they were the East German secret police that had a file on basically everybody there, right? So, you know, where in your fake IDs, if you had like a phone number or an address, I mean, if the Stasi were to have caught one of your guys, would they go to the lengths of calling or trying to locate that address? That if you're saying that you're from Africa, I mean, how deep was the cover story to protect you?
Well, the cover stories were as detailed as you could possibly make them. And in wartime, you know, if we're talking that we're going to be active for what, 3 days maybe? Yeah. And after that, you know, we're going to be on our own. These Germans are going to be able to call Greece during the middle of the war or call South Africa. So you didn't worry about that so much. Now, if you had an address inside West Berlin, they would definitely try to check that out. But as far as I can determine, first off, they did not know what names and covers we would be using. So the only way they could do a check was to get you at a checkpoint and then spend all that time to do the background on you. So we felt pretty safe in that regard. I have done a lot of research, and I went into the actual East German files after reunification in Germany. They did not have, they had, I think, 3 names of people that served in the unit, and they were from a long time ago. So their information was not so good, which was good for us.
So I'm not going to ask you about you because I've learned that with any kind of special operations that a lot of you guys feel more comfortable if it's not a direct question to you. But in any wartime, and I know that wasn't wartime, you have rules of engagement. So when the operators in Det-A were doing their job, what kind of rules of engagement did you guys have?
I'm going to pause on that one because the only rules of engagement we had was what we knew of the law of land warfare. including the Geneva and Hague Conventions, which is basically, you don't have any right to shoot unarmed people. You don't do anything against civilians. You don't hit hospitals. And if a soldier surrenders to you, you're supposed to take them prisoner and not kill them. Beyond that, if you were confronted by somebody that was threatening you, had the opportunity to hurt you, and had the means to do it, you were basically authorized to take them out. And that's what our commander always said. Don't get into that position where they have you at a disadvantage. So, yeah, that's about all I can say about that.
Of course, yeah. I like to just dip into that, and now I'm going to dip out of that conversation. So thank you for sharing a little bit. So, did your time with Special Forces take you anywhere else after being with Det-A?
Yeah, I ended up in Berlin twice. Then I ended up working at Fort Bragg at the school for a while, and while I was at the school, I was working in the SEER committee, the Survival, Escape, Resistance, and Invasion Committee, teaching people how to deal with POW situations. And for that, I was penalized 3 times. I got to visit every SEER school in the U.S. military and be a student at them. So that was not too much fun. But we did do some travel also to look at situations where Americans had been killed or captured because of terrorist incidents. And so I got to travel for that, for actual research purposes. And then later on, when after my second tour in Berlin, I served in another kind of undercover unit, we'll call it. And I can't really talk about that too much, but that took me overseas even more. Of my 23 years in the Army, I think I probably spent 18 of it overseas.
Wow. So this is going to be a kind of an easy question. Out of all the we're going to have a little break from the military and that kind of stuff. Out of all your travels that you've done in the world, where is your favorite place? To visit, like not to work for. Where does James like to go as far as just historical or a beach in Greece, or like where's a place that you have enjoyed to travel to?
I'm going to cop out on this one and say it depends. I just got back from a trip to Berlin. It was interesting, but it was not quite as interesting as it was when I was there. A whole different atmosphere. I've spent time in Asia and don't have any good connections there. The same thing with the Middle East. Some interesting cities that I enjoyed visiting while I was there, but I probably would not go back. One of my favorite cities is Cape Town, and that I could go back there anytime. But I've spent a lot of time in Africa, and there are a lot of interesting places that I would be happy to go back to. Right now, I'm in sort of the phase of I want to go see things I have not seen before. And so I'm in sort of the exploration mode.
Yeah, we're gonna get to that in a minute. I had the opportunity in 1983 to go to West Africa, Gambia. So I was only a young kid, 13, and that's when we lived in England. But that was a very interesting place to go. Senegal, they had just, I think a year before, they had attempted coup, and they needed help from the British. So the British sent in a handful, 2 or 3 SAS guys who solved the problem quite quickly. And then the French trained, Senegalese troops were walking up and down the beach, which is that was a little different, to circle back, I just wanted to ask you one last question about the Det-A stuff. So did the Stasi, and I could be using the wrong terminology, clearly that they had their own agents on the other side. So I don't know anything about this. So what would they have been called? Are they from the Stasi, the ones who would be on the west side?
I think the Stasi, in fact, that shield right over my head is from the Stasi headquarters in Berlin. Another story.
Yeah.
They had illegals that worked in Europe and West Germany, people that were very much like the Russian illegals in the United States. They would go there, they would set up as a family or an individual, and they would lie low, and they might be there to gather intelligence. But they also had some people that they sent across to be advance force in case of war. They had basically two groups that I am aware of, and their names changed throughout the history of the Stasi. But one group was called the Main Department 22, and it was concerned with communism, counterterrorism. Now that was their title, counter-terrorists, but they trained terrorists. They had very close relations with the PLO, the Red Army faction in Germany, the ETA in Spain, the IRA, and so that was one group. And then there was another group that was called the AGMS, the Working Group of the Minister, the Special Working Group of the Minister. And they were basically charged with the same sort of stuff as the Russian organization that used to be called SMERSH, which was death to spies. And they were trained as saboteurs, assassins, and reconnaissance folks. Not very many. As far as my research tells me, there were about 150 of them. But that's enough. And the Russians still have a unit like that now. Sounds like somebody's zip code. I think it's unit 952 or something along that line. So they were out there, yeah.
Oh.
Not specifically looking for us, but looking to do the same thing. Was if the Russians attacked or the East Germans attacked with the Russians, they will be sent forward to try to hit strong points in West Germany or other NATO countries to cause trouble, just like we were.
And now with that group, because I really don't know much about that history. Did they actually assassinate anybody? Was it proven that they reached their objective?
Yes, they did. they had a number of and quite a few of them were for former East Germans who escaped to West Germany. That obviously the government did not appreciate that, and so they sent out people to take them out. Quite a few, actually. I think the numbers would be in the 20s and 30s, but that's quite a few. Yeah.
Wow.
And the Russians, like I said, the Russians are still doing that. People exit the window and find out that's not the best way to get to the ground floor.
No, I mean, it's really not funny, but I think with present company that I can say this. I mean, when you're reading the paper and there's somebody in Russia that mysteriously falls down a flight of stairs or falls off the balcony. Wow, that seems to be quite common. That's must be some faulty workmanship there, right?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So to do the segue between your military career and then you joined the CIA, that's where it leads to?
I was recruited. I was asked to join. I had met and married my spouse, and she was a diplomat, and we were being posted to Africa, and the agency decided they needed to hire somebody that was going to that country. So initially I was hired as a contractor. But after 2 years, they decided I would probably be better served and making far less money than a contractor as a staff officer. So I did a transition, and I stayed with the agency for another 13 years. So.
Wow. I have learned from my own, research that my comfort level is more to do with military history, even aspects of the CIA being involved in the Vietnam War. I know one guy whose brother was a case officer, and he was killed in Vietnam. And when the brother attempted to find out more about him, it was still like a closed door. So I'm not going to ask you any more questions about that, but let's talk about your books, because I mean, you've written some amazing books. Mission Iran, and that's another one that I don't know too much about. We just touched on the Special Forces, Berlin, and then Masters of Mayhem. So can we talk a little bit about your book, Mission Iran?
Mission Iran is, again, it's about Special Forces Berlin. It's a little known aspect of the Iran rescue operation, which was called Eagle Claw, that did not go so well initially, but very few people know that there were basically, along with the Air Force and the Navy and the Marine pilots, there were 3 Army units involved. The one force, Delta, out of Fort Bragg. The Rangers, who were doing security duties at Desert One and would also have a mission later on. But also, there was a small element from Detachment A, which was involved. And Mission Iran, my book, is the story of those guys. The most important facet, and the only successful part, one of the only successful parts of that mission, was the fact that we sent several people into Tehran to collect intelligence on the places where the hostages were being held. So those people, 2 of them came from Detachment A. Another guy was Dick Meadows, who was actually a civilian working with Delta. And then a Iranian national, a former Iranian national, who was in the U.S. Air Force. So the first 2 guys were from Detachment A, and they went in undercover into Iran, into Tehran, and collected all the kind of targeting information that you would need to pull off a military operation. And they came back out, delivered that information, and then went back in before the raid actually began. And they were joined by Dick Meadows and the Iranian Fred Arouji for the second part of that operation. So that was, and when the operation went bad, they had to escape from Iran. So that they did, and all of them came home. But that was one of the only actual successful parts of that mission. I should mention there was another successful part, and that was 2 CIA pilots and an Air Force special tactics officer went in to look at the airstrip used at Desert One. And that was much earlier than the operation went. And they went in, they flew in low level and landed on the airstrip, did a successful survey of it and actually placed guidance lights in the ground so that the airplanes could turn them on and see where they were going to land in the middle of the night. That went well also. So those little small things that they had to do beforehand. It was a very complex operation, and unfortunately, the helicopters just proved to be the problem.
Yeah, I think that you were telling me that that they ran out of gas, that they were, or one of them ran out of gas. They were, waiting to get clearance, and they were burning it up, right?
They were having mechanical problems, and the Marine pilots were flying Navy helicopters that they had very few hours on, and they did not know the equipment. The helicopters were also not suitable for the operation, but in any event, one of them got lost and sat down in the desert. He also had a mechanical problem. And then out of the 8 helicopters that launched, only 6 made it to the Desert One site. One helicopter stopped and picked up the crew that had landed and took them back to the aircraft carrier. And then 6 helicopters continued on. As they landed, one of the helicopters had a red light and had to shut down and was not operational. So they had 5 helicopters. And at that point, they said, we can't continue the mission. They were going to abort it and try it later. But then the accident happened, and a helicopter collided with one of the tankers on the ground. So it all ended that way.
Now there is a tie-in with Canada. The hostages went to the Canadian embassy. Is that correct?
Long before this, and there's a book out on it called Our Man in Tehran. It's about your ambassador in Tehran, and six employees of the American embassy, when the embassy was seized in November, went to the Canadian ambassador's residence and hid out there, and he permitted that. And he was basically the interlocutor between these 6 Americans in his house and the United States. And he was able to communicate with the United States through his telecommunications. And he gave the information to the United States about those people. And with that information, that's when the agency launched its rescue mission to get those people out. And now I can't remember the name of the movie.
I know it's got Ben Affleck in it. Yeah.
Ben Affleck's movie, yes.
Yeah.
And that was another success there. So the agency got those 6 people out, pretending they were all part of a crew to film a science fiction movie. So that was quite a fun movie. Most of it's true.
So what inspired you to become like an author? I mean, you're like a historian and an author. So what it's I know from my own experience, it can be very daunting to do your first book, and then when you do your first book, you go, okay, maybe I'll try and do 2, right? So at what point in time did you decide that you wanted to become an author?
I had actually been tinkering around writing some stories while I was in the Army. So it was just sort of a continuation of something that I had begun. And I, of course, got interested in history. Once when I was in Africa, I got interested in a particular aspect of World War I that did not have a whole lot of information on it. I started doing research on it, and I decided, well, if I'm going to do all this research, I might as well try to put it into a book, and I did. And then the second book kicked up, which is my Special Forces Berlin history, and somebody knew that I had written the history of World War I in Africa. And we got to talking about who would document the history of special forces in Berlin. And we came up with a conclusion that the U.S. Army would never do that. So basically, I got volunteered to start that book, and that started another 3-year process of putting that all together. Talking to my comrades, to a lot of the earlier people that had served in the unit, dealing with the Army and a few other agencies along the way. So it was quite a process. And part of it too, it can be difficult. You're dealing with some people that don't want to talk to you, that don't understand what you're doing. The military is not very cooperative on things like this. I got very little information out from them. So it can be daunting, but it's a worthwhile endeavor when you can sit down and say, okay, I captured something that my comrades and their families can have to document what they did. So.
And I'm sure that with your Det-A book, that there's a lot of content that you wanted to put in there, but it was red flagged and you weren't able to, right?
Yeah, either between my friends saying, I'm going to tell you a story, but you can't use it, or the censors saying, no, you can't put that in there. So, yeah.
Now, as we circle around, and I want to talk to you about your, you wrote a book about a very famous English colonel, and I could go as far to say that he was probably one of the first special ops kind of guys that, behind enemy lines, blowing things up. And Masters of Mayhem is the name of the book. So can we talk a little bit about Colonel Lawrence?
Well, Colonel Lawrence is one of the figures that has always been lurking in the background of my mind since I got to see the movie in 1963, Lawrence of Arabia. Yep. My family, my father and my brothers took me to that. So I always thought he was taller, but that's Peter O'Toole. Anyway, when I was writing my book about the Germans and South Africans in Africa, a lot of the terrain I was looking at was desert-like. And I was not only doing research in the archives, but I was going out looking at the battlefields. And I had the good fortune of going into the Namibian archives and finding a picture of one of the British forces that was attached to the South Africans, and it was a Rolls-Royce armored car detachment. And I said, I've seen these guys before, and Lawrence of Arabia had them. So I started looking around. I wanted to find out how I should attack this book. How should I attack the history? And not only did I read Lawrence's writings, but I did a lot of Google searching, and I found out that there was an expedition going to Jordan. It actually was a 10-year thing, and I joined it halfway in and went on it 3 times. That was exploring Jordan, basically following the 7 pillars of wisdom that Lawrence wrote, trying to find out how accurate it was, because there were a lot of people who were saying, he made things up. It's not true. What we were able to determine after 10 years was it was very true, and we've got not only the documentary, but we've got the physical evidence on the ground. And while I was out there, I was sitting on a hilltop looking at a battlefield site that was about 10 kilometers long. It was a railway, and everybody's seen the movie where he blows up a train. Well, that's one aspect of this, but this was an aspect of the campaign that I did not know about, where he and his Arab forces actually attacked 3 different sites at once on this long stretch of railway, and they were fortified sites occupied by the Ottoman Turks. But the thing about it wasn't just Arab guerrillas on horseback. Integrated into that was another British unit that was mobile artillery. They had trucks that had small cannons loaded into the back, and they would unload them and use them for covering fire, and then they'd throw the things back in the truck and take off and move to other places. So you've got mobile artillery. And then they've got the Rolls Royces. They've got a section of Rolls Royces, about 4 cars strong, that are equipped with machine guns, 303 caliber Lewis guns. Vickers machine guns, and they were using those in the attack. And then they had the Royal Flying Corps was actually sending people forward with BE-2 aircraft, and they were dropping bombs on these sites. And so all this was integrated. Even the Navy was involved supplying them. So Lawrence was working this out with General Allenby as a diversion for Allenby's main thrust that was on the coast of what is today Lebanon. And as I'm sitting there on the hill going, how did they put this all together? And this is where I suddenly had this epiphany that this is probably one of the first special combined operations in modern history, where they have integrated air assets, mobile ground assets, guerrilla forces, and British advisors working with all of them. So that was the genesis of when I decided to write this book. And I said, Lawrence is one of the founding fathers of modern special operations. The British histories tend to start it off in World War II. But as I was researching it, many of the guys that started this stuff in World War II, Sterling, who was the head of the SAS, Bagnold, who was the founder of the Long Range Desert Group, got a lot of their ideas and information from Lawrence. And Mao Zedong, the generals in Vietnam all used 7 Pillars of Wisdom as one of their foundation pieces of guerrilla warfare. So that's where that book started. And yeah.
And I know that in the movie, of course, it's a movie, and we all know that movies are not completely accurate. But in the movie itself, Lawrence is left kind of bitter because he's actually become Arab, as it were. He's become friends with them. He's so ingrained. And then the British government, if I'm remembering correctly, kind of not really turned on Lawrence, but they didn't follow through with the promises. Is that correct?
Basically, yeah. Between the British government and the French government, they had what was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which split the Middle East up between the two countries. And the United States, to its credit, but unfortunately not enough to its credit, tried to work a different piece out, but because the French and the British were adamant about how this was going to happen, the Middle East got divided up, and the results were not so much to what Lawrence wanted. He wanted basically the Hijazi Arabs of Faisal and his group to be more prominent in the negotiations, and they were basically shut out. A lot of it was because of a newly found amount of oil in the Middle East, and that's what pretty well called the shots from then on. So it was one of those parts of war that never turned out quite like you wanted to. And had it played out different, well, we'd be looking at a whole different world right now. I don't know what it would look like, but yeah. Yeah. So yeah, he was disappointed.
So as a tail end to this chat that we're having, anybody? Oh, we should just briefly talk about. You have written Snake Eater Chronicle. So can we just touch on that before that we end this chat?
I'll try to keep this one brief. Basically, I told you I was interested in writing early on, and when I first started writing, I was trying fiction. So while I was in Berlin, I had so many interesting things happen around me. A lot of those were not able to be put into my nonfiction book that I decided to write them as fiction. So the first 4 books, at least, are compilations of things that happened in Berlin or close to Berlin or elsewhere that I have kind of assembled into one coherent story. So it's they always say you write what you know, and so these are the people, the characters in my books are people that I served with. Some of them I like, some of them I don't. And then a few of them on the other side are people that I know of, and I put them into those positions. So I know your listeners are very interested in MACV SOG and Special Operations Group. I should mention that Detachment A had a total of about 25 veterans of MACV SOG. And so a lot of those guys these are the guys that are helping us do our training. So we've got folks that know the field side of things, the jungle side of things, of how to work in the woods. And then we had a lot of guys that were more adept at working in urban operations. But our SOG veterans were very important to the unit, and a lot of them show up in my books. Nick Brockhouse may be in there somewhere.
Yeah. How can you not involve, Nick?
Fear and Loathing in Berlin.
Yeah. So I think, and for the listeners who would like to purchase your books, I assume that they're on Amazon.
They're on Amazon. Some of them you can get direct from the publisher, who is Casemate. Or Double Dagger is my newest publisher, but my nonfiction is definitely with Casemate. But Amazon's a good place to go.
Okay, so anybody who wants that information, they can contact me, and then I can pass it on. I'll put it into the credits so that we can make sure that some business goes your way. So thank you very much for taking the time. I try and keep these things to an hour because I know everyone's busy. So I'm going to conclude this now. I don't go anywhere. I want to share something with you about Colonel Lawrence that you might find interesting. So I'm going to end the recording now. So thank you, sir.
Thank you, Jason. Good to talk.
You too, and we'll talk to you soon.